You gotta wake up to a world that's real. You gotta rise up and make it feel. Life in full measure is more than just pleasure. Wake up and live.
Hello and welcome. Today is Monday, February the 23rd, 2015. This is Paul Sandhu coming to you with another episode of Wake Up and Live Radio. I have a repeat guest with me on the line today, which is Jeff Nielson from British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And Jeff's website is bullionbullscanada.com. Jeff is a writer and an analyst of great excellence. And since Jeff has been with us several times in the past, I won't do a long-winded introduction. So hello and welcome, Jeff.
Hi, Paul. Nice to be back again.
Good to have you back on, Jeff. Since this is our first program of this year, although we already almost 2 months have gone by, there has been a lot of activity that has happened in the financial/economic arena, as I'm sure you must have observed. So where shall we begin with today? What's the most pressing issue that you are studying at the moment?
Well, the toughest question that you might be able to ask me is to try to pick out, which one thing is more alarming than anything else, because there's simply so many reasons for us to be particularly alarmed by the deterioration of events. It would be hard for me to actually pick out just one thing.
Right. Yes, of course, since the very beginning of the year, we have had the Swiss that removed their peg. Of course, the oil price, which we discussed in our last show, which was towards the end of last year, and that was when it was starting to decline. And that has, of course, been a big subject, especially in Canada, because I think it's affecting our economy adversely for sure. And then this whole story about Greece, that is still an ongoing saga. And to be honest with you, this Greece story, is giving me a big headache, and I'm sure it has a lot of people, because this has been, it's like Groundhog Day, every couple of months, every year, it just keeps to pop back up, and then it disappears into the background. Do you think it's going to disappear again, and basically the status quo will be maintained, or are we looking at something perhaps more dramatic that is about to happen?
Well, we're going to see something dramatic. The only question remaining is which way the drama is going to unfold. Definitely, things are not going to go back to the status quo in terms of the same sort of burying everything and forgetting about it that we went through for the past 6 years. What we have here with the Greek situation is two things that are different. First of all, we have an honest and legitimate government representing Greece and the Greek people, and they've made it very clear they're no longer going to participate in the EU's fake bailouts, where these traitorous bankers pretend to be helping these governments while all they're actually doing is piling even more debt on top of bankrupt economies. So in that respect, we've reached a line in the sand, and of course, what normally happens when we have an impasse of this nature is that the bankers, being financial psychopaths that they are, simply seek to destroy any government that seeks to oppose their will. So this is what we're certainly seeing both publicly and behind the surface. Publicly, we have just a daily barrage of the most dire economic threats if Greece's government doesn't knuckle under and agree to more fake bailouts where they can pile more debt onto the bankrupt nation economy. Behind the scenes, of course, we're obviously seeing, or we're not seeing, but obviously it's taking place, similar pressure, maybe even greater pressure on this government, and very possibly also what it does in other regimes, which is seek to internally destabilize nations through their control over the media, even staging acts of violence, and that, what we've seen in Ukraine, except in a somewhat milder level at this point.
Okay, so Jeff, you were talking about this problem that is going on in Greece, and when you look at it in the big scheme of things, like what I've been reading is that Greece has a debt of about $340 billion. Now, you and I both know that over the last 7, 8 years alone, like through QE, the central banks have pumped in trillions. They have basically created trillions out of thin air. So what's the big deal with creating, say, 340 billion and just dealing with this and not letting it get to be a big issue? So there has to be more to this story than just that $340 billion debt. Can you elaborate on that?
I think that the uh, concept that people should focus on that kind of explains this, perhaps best of all, is the phrase extend and pretend. And, of course, people that have been following the economic situation for a while are probably familiar with that phrase being applied to the U.S. economy and, both corporate debt, municipal debt, and, of course, federal debt. It's a bankrupt nation. It's a bankrupt economy in every sense. But people simply refuse to acknowledge the bankruptcy. They continue to roll over debt at ridiculously manipulated, subdued interest rates, and thus there's the pretension that the whole Ponzi scheme is still sustainable. But in fact, it's just an act of mass denial, not accepting the arithmetic, which is that the U.S. is bankrupt through and through. So this is what we're at with Greece, is the extend and pretend has gone on for so long that it's now at a ludicrous extent. Excuse me. By coincidence, I'm just in the midst of writing a new commentary specifically on these insane debt to GDP ratios and how they, quote unquote, demand debt jubilee. And, it's, we don't even have a word to describe the economic status of our governments now, because the most extreme word we have is bankruptcy. And we have so many regimes that are way, way beyond the economic point of bankruptcy. All we can really do is come up with a new phrase and call it ludicrous bankruptcy. So, we've got all these governments that are now at ludicrous bankruptcy levels. And so the extend and pretend game becomes that much more ridiculous. And it's like any sort of Ponzi scheme. They grow larger and larger and larger. And then no matter how much control you have over the media, no matter how much financial control you have over markets, you can't hold the Ponzi schemes together any longer.
Yes, you are absolutely right there that yes, this extend and pretend. It is really for a lot of people who have been like myself, who have been following this along for a number of years now. It does get very frustrating because the pretense has gone on a lot longer than most of us would have thought that it would be possible. So I'm just wondering how long this pretense can continue. Do you think it's another before this big, explosion or collapse actually happens? Could it be like, let's say, another 5, 10 years out, or do you anticipate something bigger and more drastic in a shorter time period?
Well, of course, the financial psychopaths would like to continue this game on and on, for more and more cycles ad infinitum, but it's simply not possible. And what I'm looking at now over the shorter term is, that as I think I've mentioned already to your own audience, I'm fully expecting the quote-unquote next crash to be a scheduled event for sometime in 2016 to coincide with the next U.S. election cycle. And, that was simply an observation I picked up from Warren Pollock, who and other people who simply observed that the last two manufactured crashes were also scheduled to coincide with the U.S. election cycle, so that the old regime could be blamed for the crash, and the new regime could ride in as a supposed white knight that was going to rescue everyone. And then they just simply reverse roles every 8 years, and the zombie population never notices. So with the next crash apparently scheduled for 2016, my operating premise at this point is that there is no way these Ponzi schemes can survive even a manufactured event, no matter how carefully it's managed. Things are so ridiculously unsustainable now that once they allow any sort of a sinking, quote-unquote, deflationary effect to take hold, we're just going to see kaboom. They're just things are too extremely out of balance, and we need to look no further than the U.S. economy.
Yes, let's talk about the U.S. economy. You recently wrote an article saying that the U.S. economy, something to the effect that the U.S. economy is dead. So, what led you to to that very, I'd say, dramatic conclusion?
Well, the conclusion may be dramatic, but it's simply the logical extension of more and more overwhelming evidence which continues to point in this direction. Uh, One of the things I focused on was the chart of the U.S. velocity of money. And for readers that don't understand that concept, in a capitalist system, the velocity of money, which means the speed at which money is spent and respent, can be considered to be the heartbeat of an economy. And so what I simply observed is when you look at a chart of the U.S. velocity of money, we see it having descended to a level below any other level in recorded history. So, of course, if you look at this in medical terms and you had a chart of somebody's a human being's heartbeat and you saw their heartbeat go lower than it had ever been at any other point in their life, the logical conclusion would be that a person is about to die. Now, more recently, and as you already noted, we've seen the manufactured collapse in oil prices. And of course, the spin-off for that is a plunge in gasoline prices. Now, for the last quarter century, there's been no more tried and true means of stimulating the U.S. economy than to depress gasoline prices. It's been kind of like an automatic shot in the arm for that Ponzi scheme economy. But what do we see today? We see oil prices having been cut in half. We see big oil having passed along nearly the entire drop in oil prices in the form of lower gas prices, something it almost never does. And yet, despite the fact that U.S. gasoline prices have nearly fallen in half from 2014 levels, not only is there no sign of stimulus in the economy, but we've seen a rapid collapse in its retail sector. And of course, this is, as everyone knows, a consumer economy. So, what does it mean when the retail sector of a consumer economy collapses at the same time that economy is getting its strongest form of stimulus? You can only conclude that it's a dead economy. And of course, further reinforcing that, we have the insanity of permanent 0% interest rates. And once again, I used a medical analogy there and pointed out that 0% interest rates are the economic equivalent of a defibrillator. And so what we have effectively are these economic charlatans defibrillating the U.S. economy with these 0% interest rates, jolting this economy again and again and again. And of course, you would never see a doctor act like this. A defibrillator is an emergency last resort measure, and like all last resort measures, if it doesn't work right away, it's never going to work. When we didn't see these zombie economies immediately explode into a surge of economic activity once this regime of zero interest rates began, it was obvious at that point that we would never see any real reaction. And of course, once again, when there's no reaction to extreme stimulus, the obvious conclusion is that we're dealing with dead economies.
So what has been done, as I see, is that some illusions have been created. One of them, of course, being the stock market. Now, how can the stock market be at all times highs when you are telling us that the retail numbers have been brutal and all the energy companies are bleeding cash? It's they are not making anywhere near the kind of profits they were, if they are making profits at this time. So the manufacturing is in the toilet. And then, of course, they had the port problems on the West Coast. So a lot of those goods were not even making it into the U.S. So given all those things, like, how is it possible that the stock markets are at all-time high and everybody is kept focused on that number while all these other indicators are hidden from view?
Well, the best way to answer your question is with another question. And that question would be, how is it that U.S. stock prices and U.S. bond prices are both at all-time highs simultaneously? Because anyone who has the slightest understanding of markets knows that these two asset classes are counter-cyclical. When one reaches a peak, the other must reach a trough. So if one is at an all-time high, we would suspect the other would be at some trough and perhaps even an all-time low. So, of course, seeing U.S. stock prices and U.S. bond prices, U.S. Treasury prices, both at all-time highs simultaneously is mathematically and economically impossible in any sort of faintly legitimate system. So when we see something that is economically impossible and continuing month after month, year after year, then we get an answer to your original question. How are these prices at their ridiculous highs? Total and absolute manipulation. And of course, there I simply refer back to what I've already mentioned to your audience in previous interviews, which is that the one bank has what I call a master algorithm, which it uses to manipulate all markets. This so-called high-frequency trading, quote unquote. It is a very simple process when you control the media and are allowed to use these manipulative trading algorithms, and when you have access to literally countless trillions in capital to use for manipulation, that you can totally control all prices in all markets. And of course, it's only when you can control all prices in all markets that you can have two markets that are supposed to be at opposite levels simultaneously at all-time highs.
Yes, it is indeed almost surreal to see these things happening because they are so counterintuitive to what has happened in the past. So what that tells me is that looking at historical data and what happened in the past is really not all the rules, that were applicable in the past that no longer apply. So it seems like we are in uncharted territory. However, this is not lost upon America's creditors, such as China and Russia and other, nations that are outside of the realm of the Anglo-American banking influences. So those people seem to have observed that the handwriting is on the wall, and they are taking actions to protect themselves. Is that a story that you've also been following?
If you're referring to the reduction in their holdings of U.S. debt,
Not only that, also like they are bypassing the use of the dollar in their trade settlements. They're setting up, Russia has set up this an alternate to the SWIFT system that is used by Western bankers, and it is the Western powers, and it has been used to sanction and punish nations at will. So, a lot of activity is going on that suggests that those other, Eastern economies, anyhow, they are aware that this gig is up and they are taking steps to protect themselves.
oh, most definitely, and certainly we see it in many areas. We see Russia also looking to create its own trading bloc, quote unquote. And
Right.
at the political level, we see Russia and China initiating their own security pact, which of course is deliberately designed to exclude the fascist nations of the West. But what we're seeing, of course, is we're seeing these other nations behaving more like chess players rather than the psychopaths who run our own governments. We're seeing them consciously look to avoid confrontation with the nut jobs that run our own governments, because of course you don't want to have confrontation with psychopaths. Instead, what we see them doing is looking to position themselves better and better, the way a chess player approaches a conflict. Avoid direct confrontation until you have absolutely an overwhelming superiority and can then move decisively. So we see the moves you've talked about and that I just mentioned. We see China, of course, steadily and rapidly moving to take over as the reserve currency for the world economy. And of course, the West has, as I mentioned, I think in a previous interview, essentially thrown in the white towel and acknowledged that this transfer is coming and that it can't prevent it. And we see this in two obvious ways. We see this through the government of the UK beginning to denominate its own bond debt in renminbi. And we saw perhaps even more striking example recently when Canada, our own government, announced a giant currency swap with China. And of course, the currency swap is to phase out the use of US dollars and phase in the use of renminbi. So when we have, Canada, the US's closest proximate neighbor, and our historic largest trading partner, now moving out of U.S. dollars, no clearer sign could there be that the writing is on the wall.
Yes, it must. It has to be on the wall. And not only that, there's something which I have observed, which I never thought I would see. So even back in the days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, they had many satellite states in Eastern Europe, but all those states like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, etc., they viewed the Russians with a great deal of distrust. But what has lately developed is that even countries in Western sphere of influence like Germany and France, they seem to be voluntarily leaning towards East and aligning themselves with Russia voluntarily, not by force, as a lot of those other Eastern European countries had to in days gone by. So this idea of a developing bloc, which is ready to take on the behemoth that is the United States, it seems to be well along, and I suppose it's one of those things like that Hemingway quote, how did you go bankrupt, first slowly and then suddenly. So as the abandonment of the dollar, it may be in a slow phase right now, but then it could happen very, very suddenly, and the whole face of the financial world could change almost overnight. Would you agree with such an observation?
Certainly, the possibility of a massive and sudden event is is a very real risk. But what we have to counter that with is the knowledge that nobody wants this. Even the nations of the East don't want to see the West collapse in a sudden manner because such an economic collapse of that magnitude would have massive spillover effects and destabilize governments all over the world. So nobody wants the collapse to be sudden. And this is another reason why we see the East maneuvering like chess players rather than taking a more direct path toward replacing the West at the helm of the global economy and the international system. They know that it has to be done in a very delicate manner. And for instance, I've mentioned, I think also in previous shows, that while China wants to back its renminbi with gold, we can see that because it's accumulating massive gold reserves. And while we know it also wants to take over as reserve currency, it has to do these two things in a very specific order. It has to take over as reserve currency first before it could ever officially back the renminbi with gold, because if it did it in the opposite order and it backed the renminbi with gold first, and then we had the transfer from US dollar to gold-backed renminbi, we would see a stampede of unparalleled magnitude, because the difference between the unbacked paper currency of a bankrupt government and the gold-backed currency of the world's strongest economic power would be so obvious that people would stampede in a manner that would just be totally uncontrollable and destructive. So China has to have control of the reserve currency first before it can officially back the currency with gold. And that's just one example of how things have to be done in a very careful manner, or we will definitely have total implosion and total economic chaos.
Yes, I agree. I understand what you're saying, Jeff. However, by their very nature, collapse are not always manageable and controllable. So there is going to come a point in time, I'm sure, it's like a building, which is starting to tilt over, and like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, like you can do so much to keep it standing upright, but if it leans past a certain angle, there's nothing that can be done to avoid it. So I think this is not going to be necessarily an orderly uh, transfer or an orderly changing of the guard. At some point in time, I think it is going to get very messy. What do you think?
That's certainly where I would be putting my money if I was going to be betting on things. But, the paradox here is that as we see things becoming radically more unstable and at an exponentially more rapid rate, we're seeing this precipitate a serious response from the rest of the international community. And of course, it's, the things we've talked about just over the last few minutes, and a general attitude of cooperation is finally taking hold. What happened when the West launched its economic terrorism at Russia and sought to destroy the ruble, tried to force Russia to sell its gold and just to destroy its economy? We saw China publicly step up and say it would not allow Russia's economy to fail, and it would do whatever was necessary to backstop that economy. Now we've got the Greek situation. We have, Greek supposedly isolated, being alone in its position against all of the fascist regimes of Europe trying to impose these more fake bailouts on it and bury it in more debt. Well, what do we see? We see Russia step forward and say, we'll provide financing if you can't get a deal done with the West. China wouldn't allow Russia to be isolated by these terrorists. Russia wouldn't allow Greece to be isolated. So as we see the situation become more and more dire, we're also seeing signs of international unity amongst the less corrupt nations of the world. And when we cooperate as a species, what we can accomplish can often be astounding. So, while I'm quite fatalistic in most of my writing, I do want to offer that ray of hope that there is signs of cooperation and the coming together of nations.
How what they say? I agree. Like your analysis is quite reasonable. But then again, we just, by their very nature, psychopaths are not reasonable. So a cornered rat is a dangerous animal, and I'm just wondering, when in its death throes, this behemoth, the kind of which we have never witnessed in history, which is the U.S. empire, I don't see how it's going to fade away quietly into the night. But let's hope that cooler heads will prevail as this thing implodes. But again, the signs are not so hopeful because even now, like our own government here in Canada, following the lead of the U.S., they're eager to go and to put fuel on the fire on this conflagration in Ukraine, for example, to supply them with with more and powerful destructive machinery, as if enough destruction has already not been wreaked on that country. So, those are the signs that I observe, and I say, then you have this war against ISIS, you have war in Syria, we have problems with Israel, and everywhere we look, there seems to be more tension and more conflict than ever before. So, it's, yes, on the one hand, there are powers that are working to keep things in control, but then on the other side, there is an equal and perhaps a greater opposing force. What they will do in the long run is anybody's guess.
Well, if we look at the Rothschild's crime syndicate that rules over us, what I've called it the one bank, yes, obviously it's a clan of psychopaths, and we know what that implies in terms of behavior, compulsive behavior, reckless behavior. But at the same time,
not just reckless behavior, war behavior, let's say, because they have, basically their main occupation, or one of their primary occupations has been warfare, which they have been very actively financing and being involved in all throughout their history, going back to the 18th century. So, why should we expect any change, Jeff?
Well, because, they are ultimately thieves, meaning bankers. And of course, that means that more than anything else, they're governed, their plotting is governed by the bottom line. And so what must now be obvious to them, because it's been so dramatic, is that the haul from operating their crime syndicate, their ill-gotten gains, are steadily diminishing every year. They're squeezing tighter to try and get tighter and tighter control, but their crime syndicate is yielding less and less profit. So from that perspective, there's at least a possibility of them realizing that their own method of operation is now obviously self-destructive, even with respect to their own twisted interests. And so, while we can never expect them to adopt any sort of enlightened attitude towards humanity as a whole, when they see that their current scheming is literally destroying their own empire, no matter how much they succeed, quote unquote, one can only hope that they'll get, it'll sink in that success in this form doesn't even serve their own purposes.
What about all this QE? Don't you think like that's making its way into their coffers one way or the other?
Well, yes, and by my calculation, this insane regime of conjuring paper out of thin air now provides them with roughly $100 trillion per year of free capital. But,
So what are they using their capital on? That's what I'm kind of curious to find out. Where is that going? Because that's one heck of a lot of money.
on the one hand, they've gotten such absolute control over the governments and the printing presses of all Western nations that they can now literally give themselves as much as they want for free every year whenever they want. But the problem is they can't use all of that. They can't simply print up $100 quadrillion and buy every asset on the face of the earth because, of course, in anything that extreme, it would become so obvious that this was just worthless funny money that it would immediately lose its purchasing power. People would instantly, or not instantly, but very, very quickly simply refuse to accept dollars no matter what else happened in the world. So, and even now, even with only, quote unquote, 100 trillion per year of free fantasy money for themselves, they can only deploy the tiniest fraction of that into the global economy, or it would cause explosive bubbles that they couldn't control, and of course it would cause the hyperinflationary depreciation of one or more of these currencies. So it's had to take the vast majority of this free money every year and funnel it into its own private casino, the derivatives market. So here's the funny part. These thieves have created this private casino for themselves, which they call the derivatives market. Its notional value, in other words, the total worth of all of the contracts, is somewhere well in excess of $1.5 quadrillion. Well over 20 times the size of the entire global economy. And they own all of this wealth, quote unquote, but they can't do anything with it. It's all fantasy wealth. It's conjured out of worthless paper, sequestered into a rigged casino, which has to be sequestered from the whole global economy, or this outflow of capital would just cause everything to explode. And so they reached a situation where they can add as many zeros as they want onto their own net worth, but it doesn't mean anything. They've diluted the money to such a point that it's well past worthless. I wrote a commentary a couple of years ago entitled "When Prices Have No Meaning," and of course, one of the reasons that we can see these fantasy prices in markets, where we have U.S. bond prices and U.S. stock prices both at all-time highs, despite the fact that that's economically impossible, is because we're dealing with worthless currencies, and of course, in worthless currencies, prices have no meaning. If our currency was grains of sand, would it matter whether the Dow was priced at 18,000 in sand units or 2,000? No, because it's worthless either.
No, that's true. That's a good point. That it wouldn't really matter if it was how it was priced. Regrettably, for the common man, we still have to look at the prices of goods and everything else, especially the things that we need. Need being the operative word here, like food, energy, etc. So that part where we keep hearing about deflation, do you really think that there is a threat of deflation, or are we looking more towards an inflationary collapse?
Well, this is one of the great areas of misunderstanding in the realms of economics. And it's basically the reason people get tripped up in this whole inflation-deflation conundrum is because when any so-called expert reports on this issue, they always refer back to the Great Depression, and they use that as their template for analysis. This is what happened when we had, great excess, we had a great crash. But of course, the context of the Great Depression no longer applies to our current economic context whatsoever, because at the time of the U.S. Great Depression, all of our governments were solidly solvent. So when you are dealing with solvent regimes, you can absorb a depression, and you can rely upon your savings and the general fat on the economy to sustain you during that trough, and then you emerge out the other side healthier, because of course one of the things that a depression does is it purges all of the bad debt and malinvestment out of an economy. Well, of course, today, none of those parameters apply whatsoever. Our economies are all ridiculously insolvent. There's not a single penny of savings to sustain us during a trough. And of course, not only is there no fat on our economies, but we've been shriveled through this relentless stealing by these banks to the point where all of these economies are emaciated skeletons. So you can't have an economic skeleton that has no savings whatsoever endure a depression. When things begin to collapse, we'll just have total and absolute complete implosion, absolute collapse of all markets, absolute debt default throughout our economy, and of course domino effect throughout all of the other indebted nations. And so we would never have some sort of drawn out Great Depression event. We would simply have debt jubilee. Kaboom, overnight, game over. But, of course, the psychopaths in charge of all this, they're the ones that are holding all this fantasy paper. And, of course, in an implosion, all of these quadrillions that I've talked about in fantasy wealth just go poof. So, it's precisely for this reason that we know that they would never willingly allow that type of overnight game over debt jubilee event. And instead, what they'll most likely do is do more of what they're doing now, except to an even more extreme level. In other words, to briefly avoid kaboom, they'll insanely escalate the money printing to an even more ridiculous level. And of course, that must result in hyperinflation, which is an even worse form of economic hell, but it'll be a few months or perhaps a year delayed. So the idea that we could have some sort of deflationary crash as any sort of enduring event is a ridiculous fantasy that, in fact, the bankers are trying to foster because they want us to believe that there's enough health in our economies to even survive this, and there isn't. So we simply have to focus on the fact that any so-called deflationary collapse must immediately result in either instant debt jubilee or near-term hyperinflation.
So since a debt jubilee is a practically an impossibility, I don't think that's ever going to happen. Then,
Well, no,
then
again, this is arithmetic. You pile up the compound interest and you go bankrupt. So people can't talk in terms of saying that something that must happen can't happen because, of course, that's nonsensical. As a matter of arithmetic, the compound interest must result in bankruptcy, which of course is why Keynesian economics is nothing but ludicrous nonsense. And since we know that bankruptcy is an event which must occur, and it must occur in a finite time frame, there must be debt jubilee. So the only will debt jubilee be tomorrow?
So I understand what you're saying. I mean, it wouldn't be something that the banksters would voluntarily offer.
No, but of course they haven't voluntarily. I mean, they didn't really voluntarily accept China taking over as reserve currency. What happened is, as China maneuvered itself into a better and better position to make this move, they suddenly realized that they've been outmaneuvered and that it was unavoidable. And so now they've conceded to that change, no matter how much they hate the fact that they will no longer be in control of the reserve currency. So, we could easily see a similar situation regarding a debt.
But they are trying to be in control, at least all these debt swap facilities, and London offering to yuan bonds, and as in Zurich, so I mean in Frankfurt, in Paris. So all the Western bankers are certainly lining themselves up, and knowing their sneaky records, I think it's only a matter of time before they may actually come back and be in control of that the reserve currency as well.
Well,
they've had a lot of practice at it, Jeff, for many centuries.
Of course, that debate, I think, ultimately centers on a fairly narrow issue. The issue being, is China's own central bank a representative of China's government, or is it a representative of the West? If they already have effective control of China's printing press, then they have effective control of China's economy. And of course, for that, we need merely refer back to the mantra of the Rothschilds' patriarch: give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes the laws.
Right.
So if it does in fact have control of China's printing press, then the future that you talk or hold out is a very high probability. If it does not have control of the printing press, then it does not have control of China, and then of course China can act independently of the bankers. And of course it can allow, as long as it maintains control of its own printing press and that's its own sovereignty, it can allow these thieves to participate in its system without taking control over it.
Right. So that would be, that is something that none of us can, because we are not on the inside, so we can't say for sure
No.
what the reality is. But let's see. I mean, some sort of actual competition in this realm would be a welcome event for the average people, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what it boils down to. Is the current interplay among nations a genuine changing of the guard, or is it just more stage theater?
Right. Now you said something that they will really pump more, pump out a lot more of this what they have been doing to do it on a much bigger scale. So you think that this QE, which the Fed keeps telling us is now at an end, and they're going to start raising interest rates? You think they're just blowing hot air and won't happen?
Well, you see, the thing is, of course, there's been no tapering, let alone an end of the QE. They simply said they did it, and
Yeah, that's
stopped
true.
and stopped acknowledging the money printing. And of course, once again, it's just a matter of what they said was economically impossible. We've been told by the Fed itself that the money printing they were doing, the QE that they started in 2009, was explicitly designed to do, among other things, pump up stock prices. So if you inject a flow of capital into markets for the explicit purpose of pumping up market prices, and then you withdraw that flow of capital, the markets must collapse. Again, this is simple arithmetic and must happen. The fact that U.S. markets have not collapsed means there's been no reduction of QE, ipso facto. So they've said.
So actually, I would, sorry to interrupt, but I would think that they must have increased it somewhere along the line,
No,
because the stock market and the bond market keeps making new highs.
well, yes, and in fact, that's what the reality must be, because the prices have gone higher. We know that in order to have Ponzi schemes continue to go up, they require an increased flow of capital, not a decrease. So yes, you're quite right. In reality, there must have been an even higher rate of money printing taking place, even though they claim they're not doing any at all. And this just goes back to something that I've been writing about for 3 years now, which is that going back to somewhere around 2009, the Federal Reserve began to counterfeit U.S. currency, literally counterfeit it, create trillions of dollars that it was not acknowledging and reporting, and then it uses those dollars to, among other things, buy up its own worthless bonds, which is the only way it can prop them up to this fantasy price. So all that happened when the U.S. government claimed to be ending QE was that it stopped the official money printing and dramatically increased the counterfeit. So similarly, when you have a nation that is this totally criminal and of course has control over all media so it can say that it's doing things that are impossible, then there's no reason it can't say that it's raising interest rates. They won't actually pay more interest, but they'll just, through the liars in the media and the official government will have this official interest rate that's, 2% or 4% or 6%, but it doesn't exist. Nobody's actually paying that interest. They're just pretending that that's the interest rate. Just like they never ended the QE, they just pretended to end the QE. And of course, we live in such zombie societies where, the serfs in our populations don't even bat an eyebrow when our governments say again and again that they're doing the impossible. You can get away with this sort of fantasy land where they simply say they're doing things that are impossible and they're not doing it and nobody notices.
So then the reality will only become obvious when the divergence between this fantasy economy and the real economy is so great that the truth cannot be denied any longer. And you think that that is something which the world is headed towards sometime in 2016?
It doesn't seem to be possible for there to be any other outcome. They've maneuvered this themselves. The 2016 crash is something they want. Warren Buffett's already pulled his $50 billion out of the market. He's waiting for these bubbles to deflate. So we know that this is already something that's carved in stone. And the other thing too is the simple fact that there's no more money to be made in pumping up the bubbles higher. There's no money entering these markets now but their own corrupt dollars. All the chumps that were ever going to invest into these Ponzi schemes have plowed in all of the pseudo wealth that they're going to pump in. So there's no longer any profit to be made from continuing to pump the bubbles higher. It's simply a strategic choice of when you deflate them, because they can always profit on the collapse as well, because when you're the one that schedules the collapse, you get to place your own bets first. So the only way forward for them in terms of making more money is to stage the collapse, but they can't survive the collapse. So, they've maneuvered themselves into multiple no-win scenarios. And there's no way out. And so this, of course, gets back to what you were saying about the cornered rat, and what do they do then? And, of course, the very real reason why we should all be very, very afraid. They've gotten a situation they cannot survive under the current system in any sort of thing that faintly resembles status quo. So we will have something radically different, and very likely radically worse, at least over some horrific transition period.
Now, this year, a lot of people keep talking about the end of the central banking regime, which seems like a very near impossible thing to happen, but it could. But these central banks, what they have been doing in the recent last few years, I don't know if this is in their mandate, for example, to go out and buy all stocks. Like, they have openly acknowledged that, they're buying the Dow index and all that. Even Japan, the Japanese central bank has acknowledged that as well. And then, of course, they're buying bonds. So is this something that was in their mandate, that they were supposed to do this? Or is it something that's a recent, something new that's been happening in the recent past?
Well, of course, when we have these fraud factories talk about their mandate, quote unquote, every one of them is totally perverted what that original mandate was. Because, with all central banks, they have a very simple mandate: manage the money supply, preserve the value of the currency. And so anything beyond that is usurping additional authority that they were never entrusted with in the first place. Now, and of course, getting further into the dynamics, what people have to understand is that these central banks are superior authorities within all of our governments. They have been created above the law.
Well, that's a good point. Can I interrupt for 1 second, Jeff? This is something I did want to point out, that I hope by now people have come to see that what's happening in Greece, for example, what the Federal Reserve has been doing, and the Bank of Japan, and the ECB, and all these central banks around the world, that people can see plainly that these banks and these bankers, they are above the law. They are above the government, so that the world is actually being run by the banksters, which people like yourself and a lot of others have been saying for a very long time. But now we have been given this evidence openly in the last 4 or 5 years, and to me it's plain as day.
Well, and what people have to understand here is that the central banks have long publicly acknowledged that they're above the law, but they've done so in euphemistic terms. What they say is that we're independent, quote unquote.
Right.
But here's, of course, the point of logic.
There was something in Turkey, by the way, where the prime minister is trying to, imprison the central banker, and they have a big open conflict going on right now that I read about.
It's a difficult point of logic. When we, of course, only have one economic system, and we have two entities within that system. We have our governments, which control the fiscal management, and we have our central banks, which control the monetary management. Now, of course, within any single entity, within any single economy, only one entity can be independent. As a matter of logic, if one entity is independent, the other entity must be dependent. Because you can't have
right.
these entities independent of each other in the same economy.
Right.
The central banks declare that they are independent, quote unquote. That is a declaration by them that they are the supreme legal authorities in all of our nations. This is something they've been telling us for decades, that they are independent, and that's what independent means. So here's, of course, the point. It's these independent central banks that have hijacked our governments and are imposing this monetary and fiscal insanity against the wishes and against the sense of any people in our governments that are still legitimate. And, of course, we're heading towards this inevitable debt jubilee event, which these central banks are front and center doing everything possible to oppose. So, of course, we've already discussed the fact that debt jubilee must occur. There's no possible way that any other outcome can happen. And the central banks...
I think it starts with Greece.
And it would start with Greece. And the central banks are adamantly opposed to debt jubilee. So it's hard to see how debt jubilee does not result in the central banks being destroyed. Because, of course, to the bitter end, they will oppose debt jubilee. And so at the bitter end, they will be seen for what they are. Tyrants above the law trying to prevent not only what is economically necessary, but is our only economic salvation. And so when people finally see these tyrants desperately, obstinately preventing our economic salvation, then I think we'll finally see them all put to death.
Well, I've been reading now, like as Jim Willie said last week when I was talking to him, that in Switzerland, this is unconfirmed, but they are now not allowing large withdrawals, like, withdrawals of clients that have money in the millions because of, what happened with the Swiss peg and everything. A lot of their clients lost a lot of money, and they are not allowing these withdrawals. And a lot of these banks, especially in Europe, they are in a very, very precarious condition in Switzerland, in France, in Germany, and in England. So you're right, these dominoes, once they do start falling, it won't be limited to one bank only. It'll spread through the system like contagion very quickly.
Yeah, just like all of these banks grew as a disease, they'll die off in the same manner. We'll cure the disease.
Well, I for one would not be performing any CPR on them. Jeff, to confirm what you wrote, your article, by the way, the U.S. economy is dead. I read that on Zero Hedge, and I would recommend that people read it because it's a very well written and very, simple to understand. And the data that you use to come to that conclusion is also undeniable. But here's a major story that I'm looking at, and it says 1/3 of America on the 1/3. Okay, 1/3 of America on the brink of financial disaster. 37% of Americans have credit card debt that equals or is greater than their emergency savings, according to a new survey, leaving them teetering on the edge of financial disaster. But according to Mr. Obama, in his State of the Union speech, the shadow of the crisis has passed. It doesn't look like to me that the shadow of this crisis has passed. It actually seems to have grown much darker.
No, and what you've defined is yet again another indication that we're near a termination point. I was hearing somewhere again that there was another report that personal debt amongst Canadians has once again soared to a new higher peak. And, of course, we're not seeing similar growth in debt levels in the U.S. So, a passive observer might think to themselves, oh, well, gee, Canada's economic situation is deteriorating even more rapidly than the U.S. But, of course, that fails to acknowledge what we've been talking about all along, and that's, all these Ponzi schemes reach a point of ending, where simply it's, as a matter of arithmetic, it's impossible for things to progress. So what we see with rising debt levels in Canada not being accompanied by rising debt levels amongst Americans, as individuals, is not that the situation is less dire in the U.S., but that for the American population, the credit is maxed out. They would go further into debt if they could, but they can't. And of course, this is another reason we haven't seen the slightest sign of stimulus from the dramatic drop in gasoline prices. This consumer debt-based economy should, of course, be much more vibrant and borrowing lots more because their cash flow situation is better with the lower gasoline payments. But they're so maxed out on their credit that they're not even able to go into debt further. So all that the drop in gasoline prices has actually meant in the U.S. economy is that basically the bankrupt U.S. population is just taking on new debt at a slower rate. So, we see debt rising in Canada and not rising in the U.S., and it's not as simple of the U.S. being healthy here in Canada, but being much, much sicker.
Yes, yes, yes. And even in Canada, like there's just our banks who are just as guilty as banks anywhere out there. They just keep it making it still easy money is still out there, and that's one of the reasons why our debt levels keep rising because people are absolutely in dire need as well, where they need those lines of credit to go up to keep making all the payments on the previous debt that they have taken on, and therefore our interest rates were recently dropped again. So it's the Ponzi scheme, the bankers here they're certainly very active in keeping it alive. And yes, you're right. The Canadian debt levels are probably, from what I understand, family debt is at the highest level anywhere in the world. So I guess we'll have a day of reckoning, unless, of course, the Chinese come to the rescue.
Well, and of course, I can't fail to comment on something you mentioned about how our banks are now no better than any others, because, of course, as little as 6 years ago, that was not the case. What we had, of course, when the Harper regime usurped power and seized control of our government, is it went about deliberately destroying our financial system. It went about deliberately turning our banks into the same fraudulent Ponzi schemes that we have throughout the rest of the Western world, because until Stephen Harper and the Conservatives were elected, we did not have that disease. That was one of the few ways in which Canada was different from the other corrupt Western regimes, and it's yet another way in which Stephen Harper's regime has destroyed our economy since assuming power. And I also want to remind people that this is an illegal government. When Stephen Harper usurped power by illegally suspending Parliament at the beginning of 2010, that was an utterly illegal act. There was no legitimate reason for him to suspend Parliament.
He did that more than once, didn't he?
Just the one time he prorogued Parliament to.
No, I thought he did that twice. I may be wrong, but I thought he did that twice. He did that again after that.
I'm only focused on the one event, and that was
right.
When, the opposition parties had stated their intention to form a coalition and vote the Harper government out of power. And before they could do that, he illegally suspended Parliament to cling to power. And while Parliament was illegally suspended, the corporate media launched this massive propaganda campaign where it labeled the movement by Canada's opposition parties to vote the Harper government out of power as being, quote unquote, undemocratic. And of course, it's a sign of what pathetic zombies the Canadian people are, that they accepted the lie of the corporate media that voting the Harper government out of power would have been undemocratic. So, of course, having usurped public opinion, it then continued on its way with its illegal government. And of course, what we have to understand is the fact that the Harper government won a supposed majority, quote unquote, in the last election can never legitimize this illegal government, because it's a known fact that political incumbents have roughly double the chance of winning an election as a non-incumbent. And so the fact that the Harper government was the illegal incumbent in the last election and had thus a huge illegal advantage means that its so-called majority victory was just as illegitimate as when it suspended Parliament, and this government can never become legal and never become legitimate until it steps down from power and wins an election as a non-incumbent. Until that time, we are governed by an illegal, illegitimate government that has no right to be exercising power.
I personally think there's no real difference between the liberals and the conservatives anyways. I think Trudeau's being groomed and he's waiting in the wings, and he's going to come in as the knight in shining armor, and he'll continue the destruction of Canada pace just like Mr. Harper. But anyhow, we'll wait and see where that leads. But the signs are not good in Canada with all these anti-terror legislation that has been rushed through based on a false flag event. So it's we are going down the same path as our southerly neighbors.
Yeah, sadly, I'm forced to totally agree. My own assessment is exactly the same as yours, that Trudeau Jr. is just another puppet. And so
Yes.
we will not have an episode like we had when the last corrupt conservative regime was thrown out of power, where a legitimate liberal government replaced it and gave us a decade of good government. That cannot happen if the liberals get back in power. It'll be exactly what you say, just a new flavor on the same corruption, and it'll essentially parallel the two-party dictatorship we have in the U.S. So the only hope we have of legitimate government is that a different party achieves power. And, I don't even know whether the bankers have managed to infect and corrupt the New Democrats. Perhaps even that opposition party has now also been bought off and corrupted to the point where it's no longer legitimate. The only way we would know for sure is if they actually won an election.
Oh, they won't win it. Like the media will never allow it, and the media is just too corrupt in Canada, just like CNN or whatever. CBC's no better. So you know what? We'll just. I don't think NDP has any chance of forming a federal government.
Well, in the immediate term, I'll have to agree with you. But of course, using that word "never," that once again makes me kind of
Never in the short term, anyhow. Like maybe.
in the short term, and then of course, over the longer term, we need to really look at Greece.
Yes.
What people would have said about Greece after they tried to elect a legitimate government a couple of years ago and were frustrated in doing so is that they'll never, quote unquote, have a legitimate government. But the fact was that things simply got worse and worse and worse till no matter how much the liars in the corporate media pretended otherwise, the people would no longer support the corrupt status quo, and they elected a genuine reform party. So, this is the whole point with dealing with a regime where psychopaths are in charge, is they have no end game. They are inherently self-destructive creatures, and so even if they maintain their own control, the only final outcome can be their own self-destruction, which of course was what prompted another recent commentary of mine, Rothschild versus Rothschild.
What do you mean by that?
If we simply project the activities of this crime syndicate and concede them ultimate success, in other words, if we assume that they take control over the entire world, if we assume they steal the wealth, all the wealth of all the world, what then? Will they stop stealing? No, they can't stop stealing because they're psychopaths. And of course, being a psychopath, they are compulsive creatures. They have no control over their own behavior. So, if they finish their parasitic blood sucking and drain all the wealth out of the world so that there's no wealth remaining except their own, they'll turn on each other. That's not a prediction, that's an inevitable outcome because it's the only way in which psychopaths behave. They continue to prey and prey and prey upon others, and when they've vanquished all enemies, they still have one enemy remaining.
It's the hope where there are equally powerful psychopaths, like that mutually assured destruction that prevented nuclear war. So I mean, so hopefully there are some Eastern psychopaths that are able to challenge the Western psychopaths, and they keep each other at bay. So at least the people.
I don't look at that as any sort of positive way forward.
No, I know it's not a positive way, Jeff. I'm just saying that the world is so messed up. People are, that's history has always been that, it's never been free of psychopaths except for maybe a short period of time. So, let's hope that we are headed for that period of time where there will be some relief from the madness of these elites.
But I don't think it's a matter of ending up in some sort of psychopath versus psychopath hell, because the one other reality of human behavior over the long term is we see the pendulum swing back and forth. So, part of the reason that the Rothschilds have been able to create this massive crime syndicate, usurp control over all the Western governments, and effectively run the world going back for 100 years, is because the Western system was actually seen as being superior in efficiency, And of course, at one time, it was even superior in terms of the rule of law and legitimacy. But the mere fact is that being self-destructive, they've totally undermined everything they built up, and of course, they're now an example for the rest of the world of what not to do. So, rather than seeing the East emulate the West and build up their own psychopaths to create this sort of balance of terror or balance of power, I look at it differently. I look at it as, China and Russia will never be confused for being white knights. They're not the nicest regimes by any stretch of the imagination, but they've simply been up against such unmitigated evil, the West, that they're becoming nicer and nicer. They've simply seen that the enlightened approach of cooperation and seeking to help one's neighbors is the only path forward, because they see the self-destruction of the psychopaths. So, the Rothschilds provided such a horrific example of what not to do that I don't think we're going to see the rest of the world copy that.
Well, I certainly hope not. Jeff, before we finish off here, is there any other topic or that you might have? You did send me something which regrettably I've been traveling, so I didn't get a chance to really look it over, about silver hitting $1,000 or something. So shall we close off with metals? Since your website is Bullion Bulls Canada, let's talk about precious metals, gold and silver in particular. What do you foresee happening with these? Those of us who have been patiently, riding this, hoping, to see an honest pricing mechanism for this. What do you think is going to be happening this year and into the future?
Well, those who have been following my work for the last 2 years will have noticed that I've been kind of without an answer when it comes to trying to come up with rational price estimates for precious metals today. And it's basically a function of what
No, let me rephrase it. Let's not look at the price. Let's look at the value. When do you think that they will be valued where they should be rather than where they are at the present time?
Well, that's actually quite a bit more complicated question, because, of course, we won't have reality and justice in the marketplace until we have general awareness amongst our populations that we don't have markets. We can't have reform of these corrupt rigged casinos that the bankers call markets until the general population becomes aware of the fact that we don't have any more markets. So, that question gets kind of convoluted, because it's a matter of changing perceptions in relation to events. So, for me, I preferred with that commentary to look at things in much more simple terms and just look at how do we start repricing the world? How do we go from this insane paradigm where you have impossible prices in various markets and simply ridiculous prices in other markets, and get back to a world of rational prices where various assets are priced rationally in relation to each other? And so here I was helped by another analyst, Rob Kirby, and I was listening to his interview for Sprott Money News, and he was asked, how do we engage in the relative pricing of assets, given that manipulation has skewed these prices so severely that there's no longer any connection with reality? And what he suggested as a starting point is to look at the average wage. And so he pointed out that historically, down through the centuries, the average wage has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 60 ounces of silver per year per person. And then he said, well, if we look at an average wage today in our world of fraudulent paper currencies, what does that mean? And he suggested somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000. So of course, if we take an average wage that yields an income of 50 ounces of silver per year, and we look at an average wage of $50,000 per year, then that equates to a price for silver today of $1,000 an ounce. And of course, once we come up with a rational price for money, for real money, the money that actually has value, then we can start to price everything else based in relation to that. So, of course, we can immediately price gold because we know that gold should be priced at a ratio of 15 to 1 in relation to silver. So if silver should be $1,000 an ounce today, gold should be $15,000 an ounce. And then we can just go asset class by asset class and begin to reprice the world in a rational manner in relation to real money. So, kudos to Mr. Kirby, for coming up with that methodology, because it certainly, for me, was a bit of a revelation in terms of being able to come up with some rational numbers today.
Yes, that's actually a very good analogy, and I think that is the way we have to look at it. Yes, and patience is required because I think it is going to get there. How long, no one can really predict, but a lot of big analysts like Kirby himself and others have been saying that 2015 is going to be a very watershed year, and if it is, then this process could be sooner rather than later.
Well, indeed, at the beginning of the year, I wrote a commentary, 2015, the year of default, referring to, of course, bullion default. So, that's, of course, after something like that, we would see.
What do you mean by bullion default?
Some sort of default-like event, either an official inventory default in the fraudulent bullion markets that these bankers operate,
right,
or a decoupling event, where we have essentially a real market for precious metals begin to form, perhaps unofficially, that's completely independent of the official fraudulent bullion markets. So, for instance, we started to see that occur in India when the one bank imposed its gold embargo on that nation.
Right.
Smuggling exploded in radical manner, and when smuggling explodes, that results in a black market, and of course, black market has its own price. So, as smuggling absolutely went exponential in India, and we had this exponential growth in a gold black market in India, and a black market price, we had the real prospect of the world's largest gold market decoupling from the bankers' fraudulent paper markets and coming up with a real world price for gold. It may have been an unofficial price, but it would have been a real world price that people would have focused on more and more heavily. And I think that's a large reason why the one bank capitulated on its gold embargo and allowed India to resume normal gold imports, was because it was terrified of causing that decoupling itself through its draconian measures.
Right. On that note, Jeff, could you please go ahead and share with listeners your contact information, your website, etc., and how they can get a hold of you if they want to?
Sure. The site, once again, is bullionbullscanada.com, and anybody who wants to reach me personally can just look to the bottom of the page where we have contact information available. And I'm happy to respond to inquiries and letters, so feel free to get a hold of me if you have concerns. I don't want to scare people and then not be accessible to address those concerns. And then, as people may also know, my work is regularly seen at some other fine sites like SGT Report and Sprott Money News. And as you now mentioned, some of my commentaries are also now appearing at Zero Hedge as well. So, there are some places you can see me outside of that, my own site as well.
Well, Jeff, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on and to discuss these matters, which are of pressing concern to all of us. But sometimes we need, regularly we need people like yourself to come and, take away the illusion and to show us the reality behind the headlines. So I thank you for taking the time to appear here.
Anytime, Paul. It's my pleasure to participate in your.
Take my hand, little man, I have a gift for you. Yes, I know it's so far to go, for I've been in your shoes too. I've held the world upon my shoulders, I've felt the grass beneath my feet.
The rich young man growing cold inside, he turned and left me in the street. He turned and left me in the street. Take my hand and we'll cross this land. I have some bread for you. 'Twill make you smile, we can laugh a while. Just think what's in store for you. I've held the world upon my shoulders. I've felt the grass beneath my feet. The rich young man growing cold inside, he turned and left me in the street. He turned and left me in the street. I've held the world upon my shoulders. I've felt the grass beneath my feet. The rich young man growing cold inside, he turned and left me in the street. He turned and left me in the street. He turned and left me in the street.